U.S. disease clusters and their cause. The cause of most disease clusters has been under authorities' feet all along. The main cause of the U.S. disease and cancer clusters will be found in this video. This video is created and produced by Aquifers and Health Institute, a nonprofit organization. My name is David Reeker. I will be your narrator for this presentation. What is it that authorities are missing? Well, the number one reason a cause has never been found in the majority of all U.S. disease clusters is because everyone is focused on toxic chemicals and nothing else. Now, toxic chemicals are a problem, and better control is really needed. However, toxic chemicals are not the main cause of most U.S. disease and cancer clusters. All of us are exposed to toxic chemicals, yet we don't all live in a disease cluster, nor does everyone who lives in a disease cluster become sick. And that is because the main cause of these disease clusters is from a source most of us are not exposed to on a regular basis. However, each sick person living in a disease cluster location is being exposed to the cause on a regular basis. And every one of these disease clusters has one thing in common, and that's the cause. So here's two housing communities that are so close together they're divided by a common street. Community A and Community B. They both share the same drinking water, public utilities, and they breathe the same air quality. Everything appears to be the same between these two communities. However, Community A has 7 times more cancer and disease amongst its residents than Community B. Well, why is that? This is the same everywhere. You can find this exact comparison, Community A versus Community B, in every state of our nation, in multiple locations. The community with the high disease rates, that's Community A in this case, has a problem that Community B, the community with lower disease rates, does not have. The problem Community A has that Community B does not have is electric fields occurring naturally underground. We can measure these electric fields and show the correlation between disease clusters and the electric fields. Now stay with us here because we can prove every word of this. And here's how the EPA explains the electric fields. The following is an excerpt taken directly from the EPA's website. Electric fields may also occur as streaming potentials generated by groundwater movement. Electric fields associated with groundwater movement will have the greatest amplitude where groundwater flow rates are high. Yes, this is correct. When groundwater is flowing under the right conditions, electric fields are generated. But groundwater does not flow everywhere underground. And when it does, the conditions have to be a certain way in order for the electric fields to be generated. Community A, that's the community with the high disease rates, has groundwater flowing below it. And Community B, with much lower disease rates, does not have groundwater flowing below. And in certain locations under Community A, when the conditions are just right, electric fields are being generated. And when the conditions are right and the electric fields are being generated, it is the person or persons that are sleeping or spending a lot of their time above these electric fields that will become sick. Those people living inside a disease cluster who are healthy and have no health problems will be found not spending a lot of their time over these electric fields. And these electric fields can be located under one part of a house, but not another. So one member of a household may become ill while the rest of the household remains healthy. In order for a person to be harmed by these electric fields, they have to spend a lot of time directly above them, over and over again. This is why only a percentage of people living in a disease cluster will ever become ill. Those stricken with illness will be those people who spend a lot of their time above these electric fields. What these electric fields create above ground level has been measured and scientifically shown to cause a negative stress reaction to the human body in as little as 15 to 30 minutes. Short-term exposure is not the problem, but long-term exposure is. Anything that causes the body to create a stress reaction is called a stressor. I want to make sure that everybody understands that. A stressor is the cause of stress to the body. A stressor is anything that causes the body to produce stress hormones. The National Cancer Institute at the National Institute of Health explains how stress affects the body. The body responds to stress by releasing stress hormones. such as adrenaline and cortisol. Stress hormones increase blood pressure, heart rate, and blood sugar levels. Now, small levels of stress are believed to be beneficial, but chronic, persisting over a long period of time, high levels of stress are thought to be harmful. Evidence from both animal and human studies suggests that chronic stress weakens a person's immune system. That's the body's defense against infection and disease, including cancer. Now let's look at how these electric fields are generated. Geologists compare an aquifer to that of a hard sponge. The moving groundwater at times has to force its way through the tiny pore spaces in the rock, soil, and gravel in order to travel from point A to point B. This creates tremendous pressure, friction, and turbulently moving water, which generates extremely low-frequency electric fields causing an environmental stressor directly above at ground level. Now we've listed 3 sources, and this is in addition to the EPA website. Now these 3 studies quantify how groundwater under the right conditions can actually create electrical fields. This has all been done in studies, and there's many more studies. We just listed 3. When groundwater flows, it travels through what is called an aquifer. Now if you look at this picture, you'll see where they've labeled it unconfined aquifer. That's towards the top. And below the low permeability clay, that would be a confined aquifer. Aquifers can be less than 100 feet deep and much deeper than 500 feet. Here's the inside of a real aquifer. Looking directly at the picture to the right, they use an epoxy dye, epoxy resin, and fluorescent in order to show the pore spaces. The light areas is the pore spaces that the water has to force its way through in order to get from point A to point B. So you can imagine by looking at that picture, the water can create tremendous pressure and friction as it's forcing its way through that. And that's exactly what happens. And did you know that water conducts electricity? Now this is from the state of Maryland, but all states conduct this test. It's called specific conductance, and it's the measurement of how well water can conduct an electrical current. It's measuring negative and positive ions in the water. And positive and negative ions come from dissolved solids such as chloride, nitrate, sulfate, phosphate, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and iron, and can be used as an indicator for water pollution. In our case, though, the higher the specific conductance, the more positive, the more negative ions, the greater the electrical current that can be generated in an aquifer under the right conditions. Stavros, somebody we work with, is a geophysicist. He's also the director of Geophysical Laboratory in Greece, and he says that as water in an aquifer passes through the tiny holes in the porous rock, it takes up electrons from the water, a phenomenon to a large extent caused by the friction process. The porous rock becomes negatively charged and the water becomes positively charged. He also says that aquifers produce electric negative charges within the porous matrix of the rocks. The motion of these charges introduces electric currents which, of course, are engulfed in magnetic fields, thus distorting or modifying the Earth's geomagnetic field in particular areas, resulting in a stressor above ground level. In 2005, they conducted a scientific study above aquifers. It was a double-blind and peer-reviewed study. There was more than 135,000 measurements taken in this study. And before I get any further, I want to point out the red dot. That red dot we're going to be using from this point forward in the presentation. And that dot represents locations where the environmental stressor is. Remember earlier in the presentation I explained that just because there's moving groundwater does not mean that the stressor is in every location above it. It's not. Only where the friction pressure and the electrical fields are greatest will there be an environmental stressor. So for this study, the scientists wanted to conduct it above aquifers to find out if in certain locations above the aquifer would harm the body. So they tested the subjects first in a neutral zone. No stressor existed in order to obtain a baseline measurement for each person that they tested. Once they got the baseline measurements, they then tested the individual over an environmental stressor. It may have only been 4 or 5 feet away but they moved him to where the stressor was located, and in just 15 to 20 minutes, a severe negative stress reaction was observed in the majority of the people that were tested. But when they placed him back on the neutral zone, where there was no stressor, the body returned to normal. There was no more stress reaction. The scientists conclude that long-term exposure to these environmental stressors will weaken the immune system and can lead to chronic illness and disease. When a human being sits or stands on one of these environmental stressors, the body will react negatively by producing a stress reaction as a way to counter the stress now being imposed on it. These red spots represent where the stressor is. That's where the electrical generation will be found directly underneath in the aquifer, and this is where the stress, if the body is placed over this, will occur. Not along the blue line, only in the areas where the stressor is located will the body respond in stress. So again, a stressor will not be found everywhere above an aquifer, only where the pressure and the friction and the electrical fields are the greatest. But the body cannot constantly produce a negative stress reaction without suffering a consequence. If you spend a lot of time on one of these environmental stressors, immune system function will plummet. Adrenal glands become fatigued because they're being overworked. Inflammation increases, and much more. Serious illness is often preceded by a major cause of stress. Houses in communities that are located above turbulently moving groundwater have higher disease rates than houses in communities that are not. And this is a fact that can easily be shown. It's because a certain percentage of the residents are spending too much time on an environmental stressor, and their immune systems are being destroyed, and they aren't even aware the stressor exists. Excessive stress has a detrimental effect on the optimal functioning of the immune system. Now this slide illustrates the difference between an area that has moving groundwater and an area that does not. Now the area that's in green, that's an area that does not have moving groundwater below. The area that's blue has moving groundwater below it. Those red dots, those red circles, they're the environmental stressor that's being caused by the electrical field generation in the aquifer. The stressor exists on the face of the earth, where we live, where we stand, where we walk. Now notice how those stressors are not in every part of that field. The stressor does not consume every area above where the aquifer or where the water flows, only in certain locations. Then we come along and we build communities there. Those stressors are in the exact same location as they were before this community was built. So in some cases, the houses, no problem. They're not built over a stressor because there was no stressor there. Other houses are more unfortunate. They're built over a stressor, or maybe a part of the house touches a stressor. Maybe there's only 1 or 2 rooms that are affected. In some cases, maybe the entire house. But as you look at this, you can understand that it looks like it's random when there's a disease cluster. And the reason it looks like it's random is because not everybody is affected by it. But if you walked into any one of these houses, you could find out through measuring there's either a stressor or there's not a stressor in here. And if somebody happens to be spending a lot of time and are sick, spending a lot of time above one of these stressors, then obviously that's a main reason for their illness. Now this is a typical illustration of the inside of a house that's located above moving groundwater. And note that the stressor will not be found everywhere in the house, and therefore will not affect every resident. When this stressor exists, it will be found going straight up through all levels of the house. There are hundreds of unsolved disease and cancer clusters in the United States. No conventional cause has ever been found. Authorities tested the drinking water, the soil, the air, but no elevated levels of contaminants were ever found, and this is per EPA standards. Individuals within a community are being harmed, but not the entire community, as was previously illustrated. Those people being harmed are the ones sleeping or spending too much time on this environmental stressor, and their immune systems are destroyed.